Chapter 9 Mr. Dime and the Rattlesnake. Danny stayed in bed for the next 2 days. On the morning of the third day he returned to the cotton field. While the other prisoners drank their coffee, he lingered on the edge of the campfire. He wanted to avoid the glaring eyes of Mr. Dime. "Look who's come to work today," Mr. Dime said. "You ready for a real whipping, boy?" "There won't be any more whipping, Dime. I've got my eyes on you," a soldier said. "This boy came back to work, and that's what he's going to do, same as you. Now let's get started." The guard handed him a basket of seeds, but Danny shook his head. "It's your life," said the soldier. He lifted Danny's hoe from the back of the supply wagon and tossed it at his feet. "Just remember," he warned, "it's not a weapon." Mr. Dime stared hard at Danny. On his way to the field, he stuck his hoe handle in front of Danny, trying to trip him. Danny was ready. He turned around and walked away to the far side of the cotton rows. "I know his plan," Danny thought. "He will leave me alone mostly, but he will never forget what I did, how I fought him back. One day, when everybody has forgotten about him wanting to kill me, Mr. Dime will come at me. I know he will. He'll wait till dark and try to kill me." A week later, an hour before dawn, Danny felt a strong hand on his shoulder. He was asleep in the barracks. When he opened his eyes, there stood Jim Davis. He sat up, surprised to see his friend. "Didn't think you'd ever see me again, did you?" Davis asked. "I snuck out. I'm not supposed to be walking yet, but I had to come see you. I can't stay long." Davis sat on the edge of the bed. "I don't know how to talk so you'll understand me, but I'm going to try anyway." Davis gripped Danny on the shoulder and looked him in the eyes. "Thank you, Fire Eye," Davis said. "You saved my life. I will never forget that." He pounded his chest with his fist, smiling. Then he took a deep breath till his cheeks swelled, still pounding on his chest. Finally, Danny smiled too. "Good," said Davis. "You understand me." "Thank you," he repeated, and Danny nodded. "I wanted to tell you," Davis continued, "I'm not working in the fields anymore." He pointed to the fields and made a hoeing motion with his arms. "No field work for Jim Davis," he said, shaking his head. "No?" Danny asked. "Well, you are understanding," said Davis. "I am the carpenter now." Davis pointed in the other direction. "Carpenter," he said slowly. "Carpenter," Danny echoed. "Yes," said Davis. "I build things, like coffins when somebody dies." Danny tilted his head in a questioning way. "You don't understand yet," said Davis, "but you will. I'll make sure you do. But I better go before they catch me." He waved goodbye and slipped out the door. "Hey," Danny whispered to himself. He opened his deerskin pouch and tossed corn pollen into the morning sun. The night after Jim Davis's visit, Danny had the worst dream since his arrival at Fort Davis. "Your dreams are important," Danny's grandfather always told him. "They carry warnings. No one should ignore their dreams." Danny dreamed he was digging tall weeds in the cotton field. He heard something in the grass. When he parted the weeds to take a look, a giant lizard rose far over Danny's head. The lizard opened its mouth and flashed 2 rows of shiny, sharp teeth. He pulled back his head and sank his teeth into Danny's chest. Danny called out, but nobody came to help him. The lizard lifted him from the ground and tossed him across the field. Danny fell at the feet of Mr. Dime. "I see you've come for your punishment," Dime said, and just as he was raising his hoe to strike, Danny woke up. He was sweating and breathing hard. He glanced around the barracks. The other prisoners were snoring as usual. "I guess they didn't hear me," he whispered to himself. But Danny couldn't get back to sleep. He sat on the edge of his bed and remembered the words of his grandfather. No one should ignore their dreams. "I should be very careful today," he thought. Danny had coffee and breakfast with the other prisoners that morning. He kept his eyes to the ground as usual. But he knew exactly where Mr. Dime sat, and when the prisoners rose to go, he grabbed his hoe and walked quickly to the field, before Mr. Dime finished his coffee. Danny's dream came true in less than an hour. He saw the dry weeds move and sway before he heard anything. When he did hear the sound, it was stronger than he expected. Whirr! Danny knew this sound. Many mornings while his sheep grazed in the canyon, he had heard this sound. Rattlesnake, Danny thought. That's the lizard of my dreams. He turned to the other prisoners, wanting to warn them, but he didn't know what to say. When he looked to the weeds, the snake lifted himself high and waved his head back and forth. He opened his mouth, and Danny saw 2 large fangs. As the snake struck, Danny raised his hoe and caught the blow. He dropped the hoe and ran across the field to the guards. "Hey, hey!" he shouted. "Hey, hey!" "What is it?" asked a guard. Danny lifted his arm and moved it back and forth in the motion of a snake. Then he opened his fingers wide and made a striking motion, flinging his arm forward. "A rattlesnake," said a guard. "He's telling us there's a snake in the fields." Danny pointed to the spot where his hoe lay. The guard readied the firing pin on his shotgun and moved quickly across the field. "There it is!" he shouted. He raised his rifle and fired, but the shot missed. "He got away," he said, kicking the dirt. "All right, men," said an officer, turning to the prisoners. "The excitement is over. Nobody's hurt. Get back to work. Be careful where you step. If there's one rattlesnake, there are others." At the noon meal, Danny saw Mr. Dime talking quietly to a group of prisoners. Those prisoners spoke to others, but never when the guards were around. He must be planning something, Danny thought. Danny was right. But what Mr. Dime was planning was so dark and evil, Danny would never guess it. Just before quitting time, Danny saw a flurry of movement from a group of prisoners. They pointed to the ground and backed away. They spotted a snake, Danny thought. "What is it?" shouted a guard. "Nothing," said Mr. Dime. "Just a prairie dog. These men are scared of their own shadows today." But the men did not return to the cotton row. They moved to another row, all but Mr. Dime. When the guard looked away, Mr. Dime emptied his bag of cotton. He slapped the ground hard with his hoe, then tossed the hoe aside. Holding his bag in front of him, he jumped into the bushes. "He's trying to catch the snake," Danny thought. Mr. Dime disappeared between the cotton rows. On the far side of the cotton field, a prisoner shouted, "Here's another snake." The guards turned their attention to this new disturbance. "Leave him alone," shouted a guard. "It's time for supper. Come on." There was no second rattlesnake, Danny thought. They were giving Mr. Dime time to catch the snake without the guards knowing it. On the way to the supper wagon, a guard said, "We'll have the young soldiers look for snakes after supper. They'll have the field safe by morning." Mr. Dime stayed behind the other prisoners. Danny watched him hide his cotton bag in the bushes near the campfire. He dug a hole and buried the bag, placing a heavy stone on top of it. Danny also saw the bag move. The rattlesnake whipped its body back and forth as it was buried. What does he plan to do with the snake?